Hello, everybody. Welcome to another live stream for History Valley podcast. Today I'm joined by Dr. Brad H. Young, and today we're going to be talking about his book, Meet the Rabbis, Rabbinic Thought and the Teachings of Jesus. Well, welcome back to the podcast, Dr. Young.
Thank you, Jacob. It's good to be with you.
So I want to start out with this. Do you see a lot of parallels between rabbinical teaching and the teachings of Jesus?
That's such an important question. I think quite remarkable that probably the majority of Christian believers feel like there is a disconnect between Jesus of history and the Jews, especially their leaders, religious leaders, teachers of the first century. And I think one of the things you'll see, there really love rabbinic literature. Rabbinic literature really has a powerful ethical, moral message for our day, deals with all kinds of relevant issues, critical thinking, study, research, exploring different aspects of Scripture. But really, when I think we start talking about, is there a connection between Jesus or other writings of the New Testament and rabbinic literature? I think absolutely there is. And when we do a comparative study, because the New Testament itself is a document from the first century written by Jewish authors with Jewish readers in mind from this important history. Many scholars would agree with me, although, there's some discussion about the dating of the New Testament, but many believe that much of the New Testament was written before the destruction of the temple in 70 CE or AD, or thereafter, very close to the compass, which would be written at a little bit of a later time, but the oral tradition was developing and flourishing. That is the groundwork, the foundation for all the rabbinic literature during this period. So it really isn't surprising when we understand a greater connection between Jesus of history and his own people, the Jewish people. Jesus was Jewish. He lived in this Jewish environment. He grew up. His parents were taking him to a synagogue. We see evidence that they were going, as was their custom, to the temple for days of festivals, which continue to be celebrated today through the liturgy, prayers. Some liturgical scholars even see elements of these prayers going back to the times of the
Could you repeat some of what you just said there?
The rabbinic literature, just as I would say if we were studying others, Josephus. Recently, there's been a lot of study. Tal Ilan has gathered all the parallels of historical discussions in the rabbinic literature that are described by Josephus. It's quite impressive work. And of course, this is what historians have done for many years. Also, when we look at other documents, whether it would be the Dead Sea Scrolls, the pseudepigrapha, the Apocrypha, often we learn about the Dead Sea Scrolls and we learn from the rabbinic literature, and the rabbinic literature sheds light on Jewish practices and how they've developed over the years. So it's very important to do a comparative study between the rabbinic literature and the Dead Sea Scrolls. Obviously, there is a difference in time and a difference in community, but there is also something very strong that we see in connection and we learn by comparative study. And sadly, New Testament scholars have historically been a little pessimistic about the connection with rabbinic literature. And that's part of the subject of my book, Meet the Rabbis. In a way, it gets a little punchy or polemical a little bit that, we haven't had more New Testament scholars exploring the connections with rabbinic literature, or maybe even just saying that because of time or difference, it's disconnected. New Testament scholars, church leaders are always ready to study Eusebius, a church historian writing in the 4th century, or study Josephus, the Dead Sea Scrolls. But sometimes there's a reluctance to interact with the rabbinic literature. And part of this is the fact that it is a sea, we sometimes say the sea of the Talmud. Talmud is one of these sources, many sources. And so there's not only just one Talmud, there's 2 Talmuds. So it takes some time of study and preparation. And that's what Meet the Rabbis does. It's an introduction to rabbinic literature for Christians who maybe didn't grow up in this tradition, or others, anyone that is wanting to do a comparative study, to give you some stepping stones. Also, there are many Jewish people, although, they have this family ethnic bond and, have enjoyed the joys of Yiddishkeit, that they haven't really connected with the rabbinic literature. Sometimes there's even reluctance to study Talmud. Now, of course, in the Orthodox communities, or many vibrant communities of faith today, whether it's conservative, reform, Orthodox, and all of the major divisions of Jewish faith and practice today, there are distinctions and subgroups, many different groups within Orthodoxy, for instance, especially. But there is that sense that the study of Talmud, that's our roots. That's to know the Gemara, to understand how to live life to the fullest, even if you're using maybe a later interpretation of the Talmud, like Maimonides or the Shulchan Aruch, to kind of give you a guideline. You still want to go back to the sources, and the rabbinic literature represents both earlier and later material. For New Testament studies, we often follow some of the examples of E.P. Sanders or for my own teacher in Jerusalem, Professor David Flusser, certainly was highly esteemed, revered leader in dealt a lot with archaeology, but really focused on understanding the Talmudic literature, seeing the history, the literature that is there. And so these studies require scientific study. Samuel Sandmel warned against what we sometimes call parallelomania, that you just find some parallel and don't understand the context and the background. No, the earlier material from what we call the period of the Tanaim is the most important. But I think we can learn a lot from the comparative study. And to answer your question in the affirmative, we do see phrases, idioms in the Greek of the Gospels that don't reflect Greek literature and culture. But when we translate them literally into Hebrew or even Aramaic, we can see the connection to Mishnaic Hebrew, or even other linguistic connections to the early Talmudic literature. And yes, it gives us great understanding. We have some words in Greek that even come from rabbinic literature. Eravon, we see used in both literature, which is kind of a deposit, a security payment. And the Apostle Paul uses this in faith terms, but it's also used in Greek extensively. It's also used in Talmudic literature. And of course, Hellenism, Judaism, there's an intersection there that we see Hellenism within Judaism. Judaism sometimes even appears in Hellenism. Of course, the essence of Jewish faith and practice of the time was an ethical monotheism that was proclaimed very strongly by Jesus. But I have found in my own experience that the rabbinic literature is probably the most important resource for studying comparative study of the New Testament. And also, from an academic study, I would say it's probably the most neglected. And I hope that Meet the Rabbis can be kind of an invitation to begin to do more of a comparative study and to have a cross-pollination between scholars in these different fields, that we learn from each other and discuss, debate, penetrate a little bit deep to within his community, and to see how a part of this community, a parting of the ways. Scholars discuss this, how the Jewish sect of the followers of Jesus emerge in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th century as an independent religious entity with a new identity, separate from Judaism, even though there were always some Jewish individuals involved. But especially when we're going back to this early period of the composition, the writing of the New Testament, the development of the oral tradition of the Jewish people in rabbinic literature. New Testament can help you understand that, as well as the rabbinic literature can help you understand the New Testament.
All right, we have a super chat question from Constellation Pegasus. Thank you for your super chat. Did the Pharisees and Sadducees fight each other? How bad were their differences back then?
Oh, wow, that is a very important question. And I think it's one thing that would really help us understand the New Testament better if we would understand the distinctions between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Also, if these are important religious movements, where Jesus or the early Christians fit in with these movements. And first, to answer directly your question, did the Pharisees and Sadducees fight with each other? Yes, there were hostilities, debates. We see this reflected in the trial that was held for the Apostle Paul in Caesarea before the procurator. And we had Paul noticed there's a group of Pharisees, a group of Sadducees. So he said something about the important belief of the Pharisees. He said, I am here as a Pharisee. I am a Pharisee. I like to point this out. You know, most Christians never think of Paul as a Pharisee. Actually, he never in the New Testament ever said, I am a Christian. Christian was probably more of a derogatory term developed later, but he actually does say, I am a Pharisee here. And then in Philippians, in his self-description, he also says, I am a Hebrew of a Hebrew, a Pharisee of the Pharisees. And in the book of Acts, in his speech also before the crowds, he said, I was born in Tarsus, but I grew up here in Jerusalem studying under Gamaliel, the leader of the Pharisees. So here Paul is saying, I'm a Pharisee, and I'm brought here because I believe in the resurrection of the dead. And as soon as he said the resurrection of the dead, the Pharisees and the Sadducees started a great disputation, arguing with each other. They almost forgot about the whole proceeding. And the Pharisees were arguing before the Sadducees about the Apostle Paul. We find nothing wrong with this man. And I think also if we look at the Pharisees' role in a couple of passages in the New Testament, it's often neglected. They have a more positive view of this Messianic movement that's developing, and as it's described in Acts chapter 5, where Gamaliel really takes the part of the apostles, where it is the Sadducees, who were the priests, who were in control of the temple, who rejected the idea of the Pharisees, of the resurrection of the physical body. Now, the resurrection of the physical body would be very unusual in Greco-Roman thought. because they emphasized the spiritual nature, and they didn't see the physicality of the human body always in positive terms, whereas the Pharisees studied very closely the creation of the world in Genesis, where the spirit was given by the breath of God into the clay, and he became a living being. But there is a physicality of creation, and the world itself, as God says in the creation story, is good. It is good. It is good. So there wasn't that negative view exactly of the physicality of the universe. A little bit more in some sectors of Greco-Roman thought. But sadly, most people feel like the major difference between Pharisees and Sadducees because of this story is the resurrection. That is incorrect. I would like to stress that the difference really is in the duality of revelation. The Pharisees believed that the Holy One on Mount Sinai revealed to Moses not just one Torah, but two, one written and one oral. And so the oral tradition, as the Pharisees are describing it and passing it down, they say this was passed down. And the oral tradition is where we learn more about the resurrection, the difference. So it actually, the difference is deeper than just one believed in the resurrection and one did not. No, there's a understanding of how we interpret and apply the Torah with an oral tradition. The Sadducees are not the liberals, really. They're the ultra fundamentalists in saying we only have the written Torah. I cannot find, the Pharisee would say, the resurrection in the 5 books of Moses. Genesis or Torah, just in that, it's not in those books. The Pharisees, on the other hand, by means of the oral tradition, would find references in the written Torah to the resurrection, and that became a very important doctrine teaching that they have. And today, even in the synagogue, another part of my book, I have a discussion of later than rabbinic literature, that is, although often understood, included in studying rabbis, their teachings, is the work of Maimonides, who wrote the 13 key principles of Jewish faith. And one of them is, I believe in, each one of these 13 principles begin with, I believe in total faith. I believe in strong faith, total faith, complete faith, and the resurrection of the dead. So this still has a very strong foundation, especially in Orthodox Judaism, even though, there's a lot of discussion today, little differences in the afterlife and the resurrection of the dead. But, this is a foundational pillar that originated with the Pharisees, also commented upon by Josephus when he discusses the different philosophies of Judaism of the time. He discusses the differences between the Sadducees and the Pharisees, and emphasizes the importance of this oral tradition and how you interpret and apply the law. I mean, if the 10 Commandments says, teach, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy, well, you have to define what it means to remember. You have to define what it is to make it holy and profane. You have to really go into work. How do you define work? And the oral tradition went into defining these categories, certain things considered work, things that were not considered work, and they're debated. So I think this is a great background for Christians when they hear someone ask Jesus, is this permitted on the Sabbath? Well, for most Christians, since they, don't have a religious belief in observing the Sabbath, or they're not practicing the Sabbath, they never have a question like that. I do whatever I think. But if you're a religious Jew from the first century and you're following the principle of I'm keeping the Sabbath, well, what is permitted, what is not permitted? And what we find with Jesus is that he doesn't really say that I'm canceling the law of the Sabbath, but he argues really as a interpreter of the Torah, that is, using the oral tradition in order to demonstrate that what he did was permitted on the Sabbath. For instance, he says, is it right to save life or to lose life on the Sabbath? Well, this was a very strong principle in the oral tradition that has very deep early roots, which is called pikuach nefesh, safek nefeshot. Saving life overrides all the other Sabbath laws. And so we see this in the interpretation of the Sabbath today, that if someone is sick, you don't know if it's life-threatening or not. So you should provide any type of medical care to help them. Also, when you look at the healings of Jesus, especially in the Synoptic Gospels, usually with rare exception, Jesus just speaks the word. He speaks the word and someone is healed. So there's not any type of physical manipulation. And in Jewish understanding, that is permitted on the Sabbath. So we also see in the Gospel of John the argument of circumcision, where Jesus says, circumcision overrides the Sabbath law. Well, he was quoting the oral Torah in that occasion. And that shows you that Jesus probably fit in, not with the Sadducees, who were literalists and only accepted the written law, but into the traditions of the Pharisees, listening to, interpreting the oral law, applying it to their lives. And he's interacting as a member of this group, as a Jewish leader, speaking with other Jewish leaders. They call him rabbi at points, meaning a teacher, rabbi, my teacher. He seems to get that respect. We see Jewish leaders in the city of Capernaum coming to him, asking him to help a centurion here as a Roman that's living in the city. It seems like there was a good relationship with them. We also know in Luke chapter 13, verse 31, an event that's kind of reminiscent or surrounding the tragic events of John the Baptist, how he was arrested by Herod Antipas and executed. Also, something that we have sources from in Josephus as well. But the Pharisees come to Jesus and tell him, this region it's dangerous. Herod Antipas is here. You must leave because Herod wants to kill you. And I think the only reasonable interpretation, though there's been several others offered, but the only real reasonable interpretation is that the Pharisees were trying to save the life of Jesus. And also, I think it's interesting when we look at some of the criticism that Jesus gives of the Pharisees and their teachings. He gives some strong criticism, interacts with some aspects of Pharisees. He calls them hypocrites, pretenders. But he begins in Matthew 23 by saying the scribes and Pharisees sit on Moses' seat. You should do what they're teaching, but not what they do, because they preach and do not practice. Well, it's a big difference between criticizing the hypocrisy of some members of a group and saying that everything that they taught and believed was wrong. As a matter of fact, if anything we see in this important teaching is that Jesus says they sit on Moses' seat. We've even found in the excavations of a synagogue, it's not from the first century, it's a little bit later, but there was a carved stone chair, and we have a reference to a chair like this in the Jerusalem Talmud, Cathedra de Moshe. We even have great rabbis who were known to sit on a rock and teach. And other rabbis would say, look, this is like Moses on Mount Sinai. He's sharing the true message of the word. But this idea of an authorized teacher on a particular chair, the chair of Moses, may have had a physical understanding as well as just the spiritual meaning that we could derive from the teachings of Jesus. So I think it's with a lot of credibility that a number of scholars have argued over the years that probably Jesus was closest to the Pharisees than other groups. He was not very much like the Sadducees, and though there have been some theories that have connected Jesus to the Essenes with their piety and sense of holiness, purity, ritual immersion, separation from society. Really, I don't think the Essenes, you get the total picture, fit Jesus very much. And maybe some great scholars like Heinrich Heine, who was a historian writing before the Dead Sea Scrolls. Maybe if he was writing after the Dead Sea Scrolls, he might have a different interpretation, but it probably wouldn't have connected Jesus with the Essenes. I think it's really interesting that Shmuel Safrai, early at the Hebrew University in his studies, working with texts from the Pharisees, different levels, recognized, of course, that there's more than one type of Pharisee. There was one prominent school called the School of Hillel, who were following the teachings of this great leader, Hillel, and opposing them often was the School of Shammai, who had a different approach, different interpretations, and they had intense arguments and debates. And this is very characteristic of this literature, and sharp debate, disagreement, learning by arguing and debating, which is, Jesus in the Gospels, very much the picture that we have there. But there's also a group in this area that we see in the early tradition who are called the Hasidim. And of course, we have later Jewish tradition, we talk about the Hasidim, they're pious Orthodox Jews, often emphasizing joy and keeping a commandment. We're not talking about that group. We're going much earlier to the time of the Hasmoneans, even the pietists, the people who were devoted to keeping the Torah and living a holy life. Well, we have a group, the Hasidim, which emphasize prayer, have stories of miracles, miraculous answers to prayer, women praying, involved, known for their great piety, certain things that really show some connection to Jesus in the Gospels. Probably the emphasis on storytelling, as Jesus loved to tell parables also. These were characteristics that would link Jesus to the Hasidim, a subgroup within the larger, broader Pharisaic movement. Sometimes we can see when we study halakha, there's what I mean by halakha are these religious issues, how you keep the Sabbath, how you fast, how you live, different aspects, marriage and divorce, Jesus deals with. He seems to be at times closer to Hillel, who is in general to be less stringent, and at other times he seems to be closer to Shammai, who in general is said to be more stringent. One famous book, very interesting book by Harvey Falk, titled Jesus the Pharisee. I think very provocative for many Christians who see Jesus and the Pharisees not in any way related, but that Jesus is the enemy of the Pharisees. The Pharisees are his enemy, and he completely disengages in any way with the Pharisees, their teachings, or their movement. Harvey Falk was saying, well, Jesus as a Pharisee is probably a member of the house of Hillel who is fighting, disagreeing with the Sadducees. So I love this question. I'm taking a little bit more time, Jacob, to answer it, because I think it is pretty important as we illustrate the connection with rabbinic literature and really trying to introduce Christians to or non-Jews to the subject of the rabbinic literature. I've took this in the book as saying, start with something people are a little more familiar with. Most people are a little more familiar with the Sermon on the Mount, some passages from the New Testament. Maybe you grew up with the Bible and home, you read some of those passages. You haven't probably grown up with the Talmud or reading a Jewish prayer book or a tractate like Brachot, the prayers. So if you start with something you know, and then we compare it with something you don't know, and then you find that there are some really close parallels between them. It will really help you. So I really think Professor Safrai really understood this. Later, another scholar, Giza Verma, who wrote a classic book, Jesus the Jew, talked about in one chapter Jesus and charismatic Judaism. And he looked at the Hasidim as representing a charismatic Judaism, emphasizing prayer, joy, healing, this spirituality with certain individuals that are recognized as having God answer their prayers. And so he saw how Jesus fit in with that, very close to a later rabbi's very, very prominent, very famous Hanina ben Dosa, who prayed one time for someone that was sick at a very far distance. And he said, he's healed. And people checked and said, he was healed at the same time that you prayed. How do you know that he was healed? And Hanina ben Dosa said, when my prayer is fluent in my mouth, I knew that he had been healed. And so this is similar to a story in the Gospels where Jesus healed at a distance. So he could speak the word and the person was healed. Sometimes Christians, even today, when they pray, feel that their prayer has been answered. Some say, well, I have an inner witness of the Spirit that God has heard and answered our prayer. Well, I think this is very interesting that in the rich, fascinating Jewish spirituality of the first century, we see some connections, and the way that connects with the New Testament, Jesus, the rise of Christianity, as Professor Shmuel Safrai wrote about, is very pertinent. And others like Giza Vermesh have really based some work on this and developed it. And certainly, I think we're just at the very beginning in understanding this interconnection. There's a lot more to learn about it, but it's very fascinating to see the differences between the Sadducees and the Pharisees. Very different, very distinct, and yet they work together on many issues. I mean, the Pharisees would give total control to the priests, the Levites. They were all Sadducees, and the Pharisees were praying in the temple, but the Sadducees kind of accepted the prayers that were written, developed the liturgy by the Pharisees. So there's a little bit of a compromise there. And so we can see how they work together, and they had this common problem, the common enemy of the occupying force of the Romans in this period from 63 BC, after Pompey entered into the picture. Rome really is the lord of the temple, lord of the land. And the Sadducees, the wealthy aristocracy, they're much more connected politically with the Romans. And the Romans realized through the temple they can gain total control over the Jewish population. I think that's one reason why Herod the Great, the puppet king of the Roman Empire, built the temple, fortified. He did not build the second temple. The second temple was actually built 515 BCE, but he certainly almost rebuilt the whole into a whole new building project, so great and glorious. It took many, many years to develop. Of course, it's one of the wonders of the world forever, the grandeur of the temple that was built so strong by Herod the Great and was destroyed by Titus. And they continued building on the temple long after Herod had died. So, but that gives you a little bit more, Jacob. I hope this is a better answer so that we can see a little bit of the distinctions between Pharisees, Sadducees. Where does Jesus fit in? How does that help us understand that, yes, there were major disputes between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, but maybe we've misunderstood it because it's really about the oral tradition, the oral law. And Jesus is using the oral law like the Pharisees, not like the Sadducees. And this is a a part of our foundation for understanding the right approach to seeing some of the important events and the history and the interaction between the different groups at that time.
All right, let's get to the next super chat question. Constellation Pegasus, thank you for your super chat. Did the Levites disappear after the Babylonian exile? Did the Sadducees replace them?
Very good, very good. Did the Levites disappear after the Babylonian exile? Well, the function for the Levites in the temple was not needed for the roles that they played. But, there's this understanding sometimes that people had. They knew from their father, their grandfather, their mother, their grandmother, which tribe they were associated with. And obviously, if your name was Levi, you realized you were from this tradition of the Levites. And often the priest, they didn't marry outside the tribe. There was a strong tradition that the sons and daughters of Aaron, also Levites, they would try to maintain that tradition and not marry from a different tribe. So Judah, of course, was a tribe for rule. So I don't think you would say that the Levites disappeared after the Babylonian captivity. They were taken into captivity. They returned. They knew their heritage and function, and some continued to function in that way in the temple. And we see even today in the synagogue and liturgy and Jewish tradition some laws that, a halakha that pertained only to a priestly family. For instance, the priest, someone from a priestly family will recite the Aaronic blessing from Deuteronomy 6. The Lord said to Moses, tell the sons of Aaron. So the children of Aaron, sons of Aaron, are the ones that say, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord cause his face to shine upon you and his presence to be gracious to you. And may he go before you and grant you peace. Well, this powerful blessing is for the priest to say. Although if there's not a priest around, or, a father might say that to his son or mother to her daughter on, a Shabbat evening, but it was in the synagogue. You might know your priestly background because that was a tradition of your family to recite the priestly blessing at the end. Now, the Sadducees existed and developed after the return. These groups are really flourishing more in the Second Temple period, and they were connected to the temple. I think it is interesting that I think something behind this question is, well, did the Sadducees succeed following the destruction of the temple? Actually, they did not. We see that after the destruction of the temple, the group that's gaining a momentum to say we have to reestablish our faith based on the tradition was the Pharisees. And the Talmud actually records a very, very fascinating tradition. Certainly, seems to be, legendary in some respects, but it says that when the Babylonians were burning the temple, the first temple in 586 BCE, that the priests were so overcome that they went to the roof of the temple as it was burning, and they took the keys and they said, we have been negligent. We have not fulfilled as the treasurers, the ones who are entrusted with keeping the temple. And they took the keys to the temple and they threw them in the air. And the Talmud says it was like a hand appeared and took the keys. And after the hand took the keys, the priests jumped from the roof into the flames to commit suicide. And the story is really kind of designed to tell you that for the priest, for this movement, life was in the temple. Without the temple, life cannot exist. Whereas the approach of the Pharisees, the teachers of Torah, the life is in the word, the life is in the community, the life is in the people, the faith, the land, all of their sense of community, so that there was a greater emphasis on studying the Torah. So Yochanan ben Zakkai, the legendary, powerful leader of the Pharisees before and after the temple, one of the illustrious disciples of Hillel, he went to kind of a displaced persons camp. He went to Yavne, where many Jews were fleeing after the destruction of the temple. And he brought people there to, let's remember the prayers. Let's remember the study of the Torah. And so we have to continue life. We have life without a temple. And so it seems like very interesting also the early Christians. We don't know how many they were, or there's many or not, but also they were able to survive and see beyond the temple. I think, evidence is that they were very grieved at the temple. Later, we see in church tradition where some church writers felt like the destruction of the temple proved Christianity over Judaism. I don't really think that would have been the case in the first century. With we see Christians being very involved in the temple liturgy. They went and worshiped. They were involved in the prayers, and they suffered. Many recognized Jesus' prophecy being fulfilled of the destruction of the temple. Many early Christians left, according to Eusebius, went to Pella, but there are many Jewish believers around. We also continue to hear names in Eusebius of leaders of the church who were Jewish following the destruction of the temple. But at any rate, I just wanted to comment on the fact that we see the Pharisaic movement emerging from the destruction of the temple with a new understanding, going back. We're in the wilderness experience. Look at the prophets. They were criticizing the hypocritical practices of worship in the temple. I mean, the prophets, Amos, Isaiah, they weren't for destroying the temple, but they said, God doesn't care about the temple sacrifice. He wants your heart. Well, they wanted you to offer the sacrifice with the right attitude, with your heart. But after the temple is destroyed, you can see how these prophets were, giving inspiration to a people who had lost the temple, lost everything. They felt like there was no hope. And they said, no, we have our prayers. The fruit of our lips are replacing the temple sacrifices. And we have faith. And how are we going to live without that? In the wilderness, we had the Mishkan, the tabernacle. We had guidance. We had a wilderness experience. Now we're going into exile. So it was the faith of the Pharisees that carried Jewish identity into the next generations. And I think this love for Torah study, the love for the oral Torah and studying it based on the written Torah, we need both the written and the oral. The written is the foundation. Nothing contradicts it, but the oral can't explain it. Sometimes it bends things a little bit. It makes things easier, makes things clearer, but you have the oral and the written working together to give you greater understanding so that you can live a life that's pleasing to God. First, to love God with all your heart, love your neighbor as yourself, and to put these teachings into practice. Very much like Jesus, I think close to this when we look in, they ask him what was the great commandment. He said, love God with all your heart. Second is like that, love your neighbor as yourself. And we see Jesus taking this higher ethical, moral teaching that is characteristic of other teachers of that time, Hillel, Yochanan ben Zakkai, certainly some of the Hasidim, and Safrai saw a great connection between the minor tractates of the Talmud, something like the Derek Eretz literature, way of life, how to live in by faith in this world with humility and graciousness. something that Jesus emphasized a great deal in his teachings as well. So those are some aspects of your question that we see. Many people have an understanding, in the Jewish community because of their names or tradition or their roles in the synagogue. A priest is not allowed to marry a woman who's widowed or divorced, whereas the common Israelite is. Well, if your family was following this tradition, even without a temple, it would be evidence that you came from a priestly family. And so you see that. But the Sadducees didn't survive the destruction of the temple. We don't see the Essenes after it. We see the Zealots coming to a sharp decline. These were the three philosophies mentioned by Josephus: the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Zealots, the Essenes. Rabbinic literature mentions 24. There may have been many more, but these were representative probably of other splinter groups, smaller groups. But the Zealots, had their stand at Masada, finished in 73, but regrouped, and we had the second great revolt under Bar Kokhba. We know now, we actually have some of his letters. He signed his name Bar Kokhba, but very charismatic leader. Many identified him with the Messiah. I think this would have been a parting, but with the early Christians that were following, still a part of the Jewish community in some areas, some ways. But we really see the second revolt where the zealot spirit was continuing. And I think we see probably within the Pharisaic movement a purging of this highly apocalyptic, eschatological. It's very, I think what you really want to see is the zealot spirit, because certainly rabbinic literature has a high eschatology, and also there are apocalyptic mystical elements within rabbinic Judaism as well. But what I would say is there have been some scholars who felt like there was a little taming of the zealot spirit that caused the first and second revolt.
We have another super chat question from Constellation Pegasus again. Thank you for another super chat. Everyone agrees Jesus was not born in December and on the 25th. Jehovah's Witnesses are big on that. Isn't celebrating Christmas an insult to Jesus? Christianity is big on the celebration.
Well, yeah, this is a very interesting, fascinating question. And I think in a way it's outside the parameters of my book, Meet the Rabbis. And I like to kind of stay focused on, what we're discussing. But I don't want to act like I'm dodging the question because I agree that there's little evidence that December 25th was the birthday of Jesus. I think there is actually, the church fathers, Clement of Alexandria, if I'm not mistaken, was saying maybe May 31st. Some believers, just based on intuitive references, interpretations of the New Testament, well, maybe the Feast of Tabernacles, because it says in John, he tabernacled among us. This light. These are different theories about the birth of Christ. And of course, the summer solstice, December 25th, might even have had some pagan ramifications. In my opinion, to me, it's kind of fascinating that the day Jesus, the birth of the Messiah, here we're in the season, conquered the pagan calendar, whereas nobody remembers some of the pagan references. You have to kind of go back and study it. Everybody remembers that, whether it was for pastoral concerns or whatever, that the church leaders, in the centuries following, maybe the 4th century, that really when Christianity becomes the state religion, they said, well, December 25th, this is going to be the birth of Christ. Well, it was the way the new year started. We're seeing this emphasizing the birth of Christ. So I think the Jehovah's Witnesses, of course, are trying to be more biblical. They are studying the Bible, asking the questions, and I think they're right in saying, well, December 25th is not the birth of Christ date, but it's kind of like in archaeology. We go on an archaeological historical study of the life of Jesus, and there are certain places that you go that you're in the southern steps of the Temple Mount. We go to the Pool of Siloam today, where now there's really a great agreement among archaeologists that on the location of the Pool of Siloam, and it was misidentified for a long time. We are uncovering new archaeological facts all the time. So you have a place, maybe you think, well, this is a place Jesus was or walked, but then there's a place where a church is built that commemorated something Jesus said. Well, that church is in the wrong place. Well, you may have a place for prayer and to remember, a liturgical site, if you will, to remember what happened, whether it's in the exact location or not. It's in the land. I mean, Jesus was in the land, and it's where's the Garden of Gethsemane? It's on the Mount of Olives. Well, the Mount of Olives is covers some territory. Was it where the Greek Orthodox Church is, the Russian Orthodox Church, the Church of All Nations? Well, you can debate that, but to have a place of prayer where you remember it. So in the same way, I would say if we celebrate the birth of Jesus on December 25th, and that's meaningful to us to remember the light came into the world, God is with us, the stories surrounding the miraculous birth of the Messiah. Incidentally, since we're talking about rabbinic literature, this would be something connected to the book and some things that you would discover in reading Meet the Rabbis, that when you have Messianic deliverer like Moses, the Talmud, the Jewish literature, rabbinic literature, tells a lot of miraculous things surrounding his birth. And there's actually, I think, kind of two parallel tracks where you're kind of seeing Moses as the model of a Messianic deliverer, and here's Jesus following that model and that pattern. The sister of Moses prophesied in rabbinic literature about the birth of Moses, and a light was seen, a great light. And we also see, connections between the gospel texts of Herod killing the babies in Bethlehem, according to Gospel of Matthew, which we don't see in Josephus. It doesn't mean it didn't happen. It doesn't mean it did happen. But, the gospel is saying this is what happened, and during the days of Herod the Great. But it's also paralleled in the sense that Pharaoh was killing the baby boys in the Exodus story. So the first redemption is being shown in parallel to the second redemption and the teaching of the New Testament. And it's very interesting to see the messianism, the messianic idea that's developed within rabbinic literature. Of course, with we go to the first century, there were numerous messianic movements, but rabbinic literature gives us, I think there is a taming of this, after the second revolt, but we still see the discussion about Bar Kokhba. We still see the Messiah, the son of Joseph, the Messiah. We see two Messiahs in this rabbinic literature and Sukkah sometimes, and Dead Sea Scrolls have two Messiahs. One comes as a suffering Messiah, the son of Joseph, and then the Messiah, the son of David, is after the way has been prepared, he is the more political messianic leader that comes. So we have similar discussions of text and the prophecies about the Messiah, and Jewish interpretations in the rabbinic literature might help us as we study the Messianic applications made by early Jewish followers of Jesus in the New Testament. There is a Jewish method of interpretation of Scripture. And of course, there would be a lot of debate today among Jews and Christians over how we understand these texts. Studying the rabbinic literature in tandem with the New Testament can help us, and other texts from that period, whether it's the Dead Sea Scrolls or Josephus or Philo of Alexandria, also close by. All of these things are very helpful.
All right, let's get to the next super chat question. Constellation Pegasus again. Thanks for another super chat. Tovia Singer says Paul was not a Pharisee. A lot of fighting on that issue. It gets confusing sorting all of this out.
Well, Tovia Singer is, a very well-known personality, first on the radio and now in debates with Christians. I think sometimes in debates, people are picking a different approach. So I would just say you have to listen to Tovia Singer and understand where he's coming from. I base my approach on what I see from the actual writings of the New Testament. Philippians is a book that most scholars recognize as having been written by Paul himself. And there he calls himself a Pharisee of the Pharisees. I also remember an article that was written, I think, by Judah Golden, a very fine Jewish scholar, who was saying, in studying mysticism, because the Apostle Paul talked about his ascent into paradise, which is, part of Jewish mysticism, the Merkavah chariot mysticism. This was written about by Gershom Scholem, and others have, talked about these connections, because there you ascend into the Hebrew word pardes, which is, from the same as paradise in the New Testament, and there is an ascent. There is a spiritual encounter, and but it was said, well, the one definite Pharisee that we know wrote, and we have his actually words, is the Apostle Paul. And so then he's using that. So I would say that there are, there's other Jewish scholars that would see Paul as a Pharisee. There are some Christian scholars who see Paul as a Gnostic. There have been those that have seen him as a Stoic, arguing that he's a cynic. And I think there's a rich diversity, in the first century. The Stoics may have influenced Pharisaism. I mean, there is an interaction between these worlds. Paul grew up in Tarsus. I mean, he was born in Tarsus, but he's growing up in Jerusalem. And to me, just as someone who reads these documents and studies them, I see a close similarity in the way that Paul deals with the book of Romans, the Bible in the book of Romans. I remember in one seminar I had on a Sunday night with Professor Flusser, we had several, it was the first class of the year, but at any rate, it was really interesting. Flusser was asked, well, what parallel do you have to Romans? It's, as a document we're studying, talking about. And, people discuss different streams of literature of the time. But, the result was, well, there is a midrash here. There's a midrash, a Jewish interpretation of Scripture, making application, seeing the similar root from the word aman, which means truth or belief or faith, emet, faithfulness, truthfulness, and then you have a verb, believe, heyamin. Then you have the noun, emunah, and then you go to a great prophet, the just will live by faith, tzaddik be'emunato yichyeh, and then you come to Abraham, He was justified by faith. And very similar terminology we find in the Dead Sea Scrolls in Miksat Masei Torah, but also in the Midrash of the Mechilta, a Jewish interpretation of the book of Exodus. There are some very, to me, powerful connections with similar terminology and wording, which is, this is things that were coming close to the Pharisees. I mean, the Dead Sea Scrolls are not from the Pharisees, but very close to these schools of thought of Jewish interpretation. So to argue that Paul was not a Pharisee, he claimed to be. He owned the term we find in Philippians, and we see he's given that term in speeches he's made. He's claiming it in the book of Acts. Most New Testament scholars are going to make a distinction between Acts, which is written about Paul, and we could have a big debate whether it was Luke or is Acts early or later. I mean, to me, if you read Acts, you see the discussion say something of Stephen's martyrdom, and then Paul is the major protagonist. He's the main hero, the story. And if Paul had been beheaded by Nero in Rome, as later tradition says, or if he had died, a martyrdom's death, we don't have a YouTube video of it. We have some historical references to it that seem to be reliable, although historians today, as always, have some skepticism. But he's beheaded, and he had died 61, 62. If he had a second release, it might have been later in the 60s. Well, the writer of Acts would not tell about his martyrdom. To me, that's one of the strongest arguments for an early date for Acts, which has been there. I think Adolf Hardock, brought that up. Folks Jackson. So it's an old argument, but to me, it still holds. And other elements of the book itself, the language. We could go into some other elements as well, but so there, I think, where Paul says, "I am a Pharisee," and when he talks about this, he deals with the Pharisees. I think one of the challenging points that would support a different view of Paul is the fact that he had letters from the high priest to persecute those of the way going to Damascus. And so a lot of people look at this, see some of the problems with this, but I do think there's evidence that there were letters between different community leaders about in the Jewish community on different issues. But to me, Paul was a wealthy person, and I'd have to take some time to show you that. And he was very well connected in Jerusalem, and he seems to have some crossover influences with the Sadducees and supported probably for political reasons as well as religious reasons, the oppression by the Sadducees. To me, if we read carefully the book of Acts, a lot of the persecution of the early church was not sponsored so much by the Pharisees, but by the Sadducees, who were concerned about reprisals from the Romans, and they were more connected with the Roman overseers, the occupiers of the people at the time. And I wrote about this in my book, Jesus, the Jewish theologian, which I cite in that book as well. But I think that there are some strong reasons that I see Paul very clearly as a Pharisee, if not for this very basic reason is that he claimed to be a Pharisee, he claimed to be a Hebrew of the Hebrews. And you have to give a lot of evidence to show that he was not. But, there are a lot of people that study this and very smart, and they wouldn't agree with that. So God bless them. But I want to look at the evidence. I think the evidence is pretty strong to see Paul as a Pharisee from what we have in the New Testament and the historical background.
So what would you say are the best examples of Jesus, some of the sayings of Jesus being in practical perfect parallel to rabbinic thought.
Well, at the conclusion of the Sermon on the Mount, it's very, very interesting, where Jesus says, the one who hears these words of mine and does them, what is he like? To the man who builds his house upon a rock. And then, of course, that's contrasted with the fool who hears but does not do, and he is the one who builds his house on the sand. Very interesting in the Talmudic literature, this case, the minor tractates, Avot de Rabbi Natan, parables to Elisha ben Avuya, who, there's could talk a lot about him and the background, but excuse me, I'm having a little bit of trouble with my voice. I think I'll be all right here. Just give me a minute. Pardon me. But he gives the example of the one whose wisdom is greater than his works, and the one whose works are greater than his wisdom. In other words, what's more important, your study or your action? Or if you know all this knowledge, are you really putting it into practice? Well, in this powerful rabbinic parable that is very close to the wording of Jesus, he says that the one whose works are greater than his wisdom is the wise man, who builds first with strong foundation stones and then with smaller bricks above. And when the great waters come after the rains, the house stands. But the fool is the one who has all this wisdom, but he doesn't have any action. Faith, no action. And he is the one that builds with small bricks below and the bigger stones above. And when the rains come, they destroy the building. And when we study Pirkei Avot, I did a new translation of the important book in the Jewish literature. I think one of the most important for people to study to get this for the right understanding. But if you look in what we call chapters of the fathers, Pirkei means chapter. Sometimes it's said sayings of the fathers. It's in the Mishnah after the section of Nezakim, damages. But when you go to this chapter called Avot, the sayings of the fathers, we see the teaching, whose wisdom is greater than his action. You have to have more fear of sin for the action. We have Hanina ben Dosa. We also have a parable at the end, kind of bringing this together, where we have the parable of the tree and the roots. Well, if someone has action with their study of Torah, they are like the tree that has deep roots, so that even when the winds come, the rains fall, the tree stands firm. But the one who has no foundation, he has all this wisdom, but he doesn't have the action with it. Well, it's like a tree with not a good root system, so it is destroyed. And I like the way, in the rabbinic literature, you'll have more verses of scripture, Jeremiah 17, Psalm 1, different aspects to words of mine. And so you can listen to the Sermon on the Mount and think, well, this is very good teaching, but you don't put it into practice. I would say also, when we see Jesus talking about fulfilling the Torah, he said, don't even begin to think that I came to destroy the law and the prophets. Well, he said, I've come to fulfill them. Well, some people have said he fulfilled them by canceling them. Well, read the context. He says, anyone that teaches people not to obey these laws, will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. And, very a harsh saying of Jesus when he says, in that day, many will say to me, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy? Did we not force out demons? Did we not do all these good works? And Jesus will say on that day, and this seems to be the day of judgment where there's punishment involved. He says, I didn't know you. You are workers of iniquity. You say you have some of these things, but you're not really putting the teachings into practice like is necessary. So I think what we find in the Sermon on the Mount, particularly, and I have a chapter in Meet the Rabbis with some of the strong parallels. Also, my book on the parables of Jesus, I have a lot of the rabbinic parables that help us understand the parables of Jesus more clearly, where we see that interconnection between the rabbinic literature on one hand and the Gospels on the other hand. And so some people say, I don't know how to study this literature. How can I understand? Well, that's what the book Meet the Rabbis is for. It's to kind of give you a book that will bridge your understanding, bridge you between the New Testament and the rabbinic literature, and maybe help you find some other resources that can help you study and learn these things. And there are some commentaries that, we're emphasizing this connection that help you see those connections today as well. So when I began studying the parables, working on that many years ago, and actually, I had an undergraduate degree, studies in Bible, Greek, Hebrew, all these things. And when I went to Israel, I began to study the rabbinic literature, and I was just kind of incensed in a way that nobody had ever told me that this existed. I think most Christians, most people today have no knowledge of rabbinic text or literature. It's a joy to learn, to discover, to gain fresh insight. And so as I began to study this, I've devoted a lot of energy and time in my life learning the languages, studying them. It has been very enriching. And it just opens up this whole world. And now, there's more so than when I began studying this, there are a lot of translations and works that help you. And there is debate. There's debate as it continues, as we started tonight, that some say it's not very relevant. I disagree with that. I think these people aren't studying all the sources. I think it's poor scholarship to exclude evidence. It's good scholarship to study all the evidence and evaluate it scientifically and recognize, just as in, Christian scholarship in the New Testament, there's a lot of debate about dating. Also within rabbinic literature, there's a lot of debate about dating. And sometimes people just want to take one scholar that suits their view and, the rabbinic side, and they don't want to look at the other scholars. And we need to look at modern scholars. We also learn a lot when we look at somebody like Maimonides or earlier rabbinic leaders who have were leaders of communities, yeshivot, academic study, and they contributed a lot to our understanding of rabbinic literature. And sometimes they have commented a lot about even connections to Jesus. I'd mentioned earlier this book by Harvey Falk, Jesus the Pharisee. Falk brought to light something that most rabbinic Orthodox would know, the works of Yaakov Emden, who was a great rabbi in the 18th century. But he talked about Jesus as bringing ethical monotheism, bringing Judaism to the world. He also emphasized the fact that Paul was a Pharisee and talked about his observance of the Torah and how, he had been misunderstood. He was reaching out to non-Jews. He was not telling non-Jews to be converted to Judaism, be circumcised, keep all of the laws. He said, no, they could be more like God-fearers or keeping the laws of Noah, and they would be incorporated into the people of God by faith. And so, that's a big distinction. But it's interesting that Yaakov Emden also contributed something to this, a rabbi in time that seems to me to even be pertinent in the modern debate among scholars. That I hope that Meet the Rabbis as a book can encourage further study, interaction, research, understanding. And I think even today in the Jewish and Christian communities, when we study text together, we come together, we understand one another a little much better, much clearer, and it builds a foundation for cooperation and working together. And we really need the Jewish roots to understand Jesus. It's one reason why I spent so many years in translating the Newer Testament, the Hebrew Heritage Bible. It seems like for 2,000 years we have been told that the faith in Jesus will cancel the faith of Jesus. And what I've discovered, especially in this translation work, is that it's the faith of Jesus that really strengthens our faith in Jesus. And we need both the faith of Jesus as Christians as well as our faith in Jesus to properly understand, interpret, and apply the message of the kingdom in our lives today.
Well, thanks for joining me once again, Dr. Young.
Well, thank you, Jacob. It's always good to interact with your viewers, and I appreciate the opportunity to discuss Meet the Rabbis. And pardon me for throwing in a little plug there at the end about the Newer Testament, our new translation at HebrewHeritageBible.com. But I think that answers some of these questions as well. Thank you so much, and happy Hanukkah, Merry Christmas, happy holidays to everybody in this great season of joy. That it seems like people lighten up a little bit. There's a greater giving spirit. It's something we can all enjoy and appreciate.
Yep. Thanks again, Dr. Young.
Thank you.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.